We're proud to support the craft of journalism. UBS brings you the latest news from around the world with The Globalist on Monocle Radio. Be part of an international network that brings together leading insights, research, and technology across 24 time zones and 12 key financial hubs, with you at the center of it all. UBS. Advice is our craft.
You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 9th of July 2025 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Live from London, this is The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A very warm welcome to today's programme. Coming up.
It's about time the United States of America started collecting money from countries that were ripping us off and laughing behind our back at how stupid we were.
As deadlines loom for trade deals with Donald Trump, the EU says it's ready to sign something for now. But how can any agreement make every member state, plus the US president, happy? Also coming up, Israel calls up the remaining ultra-orthodox Jews for conscription. We'll examine how this will affect the military and Israeli society more broadly. We'll hear about the race to build some of the toughest ships on Earth.
Of the current fleet of icebreakers in the world, Finland has manufactured about 60% of them and has actually designed over 80% of them. So Finland is the leading nation in the world for the construction and the design of icebreakers.
We'll hear more on why Finland may hold the key to the construction of more icebreakers later on. Plus the newspapers and the latest culture news from France. That's all coming up on The Globalist, live from London. First, a quick look at what else is happening in today's news. President Trump has sharply criticised Vladimir Putin, accusing the Russian president of duplicity over the war in Ukraine. President Trump and the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu have met again to discuss a possible ceasefire in Gaza. And 3 crew on board a Greek cargo ship have been killed in an attack off the coast of Yemen. Stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on these stories. But first, the EU says it's optimistic that a trade agreement can be struck with the US this week, even if it's only on a temporary basis. But the two qualities that often make the EU a success, namely patience and compromise, are not things that President Donald Trump, a bruiser of a New York businessman, finds attractive. So what is going to happen? Well, I'm joined now by Natasha Lindstedt, who's Professor of Government at the University of Essex, and by Paul Waldy, Europe correspondent at the Globe and Mail. Good morning to you both.
Hi there.
So as we go into today, there are deadlines and there are deals on the table. Paul, could you begin by laying out where things currently stand this morning?
Well, it's a good question. Half the time, nobody really knows where things stand because they change all the time. But as we understand it right now, the U.S. has negotiated this kind of framework deal with Britain and maybe a deal with Vietnam. But that's about it, really, since Trump announced this kind of sweeping tariff package back in April. There's lots of talk that he's close to deals with other countries and the EU as well. So, I mean, we'll have to see. And everything now seems to be pushed out to August 1st. So I think it's really questionable just how much is going to get done this month.
Natasha, we have this optimism from the European Union that was being pushed about yesterday, saying, look, we think we can get a deal done by the end of this week. We think it's going to be a 10% tariff deal with exceptions in them and variations in them. Do we have any more details on what the European Union is looking at?
We don't have a ton of details about what's happening. The European Union, as you mentioned, is optimistic, and Donald Trump has changed his tune, the way he's spoken about the European Union. He had one point said that they were as difficult or more difficult to work with than China, and now he said they're being very nice to him. So they're hoping to keep some sort of 10% baseline tariff on all EU goods. And then they're hoping that they can get some exceptions and maybe some sensitive sectors like aircraft or spirits. And so there's there's some cautious optimism. Also, this isn't really a trade deal. This is more of a trade framework. Even the quote-unquote deals he has with the UK and Vietnam are really just sort of frameworks. They're not that comprehensive. And so I think, as was mentioned, the hope is that this all might be very temporary and that they can work something out. There was some kind of report that Germany might get an exemption of some sort regarding the auto industry. The EU was hoping for some deal that was more similar to the deal that they have with the UK, the US has with the UK, where the tariffs on the auto industry are more around 10% and not 25%, where the tariffs on steel are more around 25% and not 50%. So they're trying to remain cautiously optimistic, but they had made clear that if Trump comes back with really, really hard tariffs, that they will retaliate.
Let's bring you back in here, Paul, with this issue with Germany. That it's been widely reported for the last month that the German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, who, dare we say it, when he came into office a couple of months ago, was very, very anti-America, very Trump, very much pushing towards pro-Europe. And yet there are reports that he's been pressing the European Commission to try to persuade Donald Trump to spare the German car industry from tariffs, and yet it is basically understood that Donald Trump is in particular after German car tariffs because the Americans import so many German cars. That suggests perhaps that among those 27 European Union member states that all is not quite unity.
Well, exactly. And I think this points to the biggest challenge the EU faces, and that is they come in as a bloc that has to agree to things unanimously. And you can imagine how other countries are going to feel if Germany gets some kind of break and the other countries don't. And I really think that's unlikely. And I'm not even sure Trump is all for that, because he, so much of this is personal. And for whatever reason, he doesn't like Europe. He doesn't like Brussels. He likes Britain. He likes London. Everyone thought he liked Japan and South Korea, and then he hits them with a form letter saying they're going to get slapped with the same tariffs he announced back in April. So a lot of this is personal, but I think the EU's biggest problem is it comes at this as a group, and normally the EU likes to plod a long time with these kinds of things and get sort of agreement among all its member states, and that's just hard to do this time because they don't have the time to do that, and they're up against an adversary, if you will, who really doesn't like them.
And indeed, and just coming back to you on this one, Natasha, the idea that Trump likes London more than he likes the European Union is being borne out into quite a few reports this morning, suggesting that actually the deal that the European Union is working towards with the United States is not as favourable as the trade framework that has been agreed between the United States and the UK.
That's right. And that's actually what some representatives within the EU, such as Sweden, for example, had stated, that this isn't a very good deal that he's offering the European Union. He just happens to like the UK. There are a bunch of different reasons for that he likes sort of all the pomp and circumstance, and he likes the royal family. But he also had noted that the trade deficit between the UK and the US isn't very big. And so he said, I like them because of that. He likes Keir Starmer. Keir Starmer was good in terms of providing sort of like a charm offensive on Trump and was able to win him over. So these are the things that are going in the UK's favor, whereas he's always really disliked the European Union, and they've been trying to be nicer to him rather than to provide a tough stance. But they're very unlikely to get a deal that's as good as the one that the UK has with the US.
Indeed, and Paul, just going back to Friedrich Merz, he's been making quite a lot of loud noises about potential retaliatory measures in case things go wrong. Do we know what these might be and whether they are a good idea or not?
Well, I mean, that's an interesting point. Merz was at the White House. He made one of those visits, these high-profile kind of television visits, and it seemed to go well. But the EU has been a lot firmer than some other countries in saying that if they don't get a deal they like, they're going to slap retaliatory tariffs on the U.S. They've drawn up a list, things like, bourbon and these kinds of things. And they've even mused about maybe going after the service sector, where the EU does run a surplus in trade with the U.S. So they have talked pretty tough, but it remains to be seen whether they'd ever go through with anything like that.
And Natasha, this idea that this is still a US-EU or US-UK transactional world, that last night we had the French President Emmanuel Macron on a very enjoyable state visit to the United Kingdom, telling the EU and Britain to de-risk, to reduce reliance on US and China. This is Macron thinking way ahead into the future, isn't it? Or is it? Is he thinking about trying to break away now?
No, I think he's trying to provide strategic advice to the UK. And he had mentioned that it was regrettable that the UK had left the European Union. And he's been working on ensuring even stronger ties between France and the UK, and understands that greater reliance on both the US and China provide risk. Anytime that something goes wrong, then you're incredibly exposed, because these obviously are huge, massive countries in the world of trade. So I think he was just trying to provide long-term advice. He's done this before also just with European security, talking about the fact that Europe needs to be independent from the US security umbrella. So I think he's always thinking long-term.
And just coming back to you on this one, Paul, the long-term prospects as well from within the European Union, that there is that fear, isn't there? Or rather, there is that suggestion that Donald Trump can often change his mind and can pull back from the brink at the last moment. We are hearing so much about the expression taco. Trump always chickens out. Is there a sense from Europe that they might be banking on Trump backing down at any point, or are they ploughing on, assuming that Trump will actually just carry on with imposing the tariffs?
Well, I mean, I think who knows, right? But I think you just have to ask again, the Japanese and South Koreans, they thought they were on track to negotiate a trade deal. Their countries, Trump has never really said he doesn't like the way he has said he doesn't like the EU, and they didn't get anywhere with their negotiations. So I think if I was in Brussels, I'd be pretty leery about Trump, A, changing his mind, and B, being confident that he's going to stick to whatever he said today. So I think it's going to be very, very difficult for the EU going forward. I think they're really going to have to look at retaliatory tariffs. And, they are a big trading bloc, and they are an important trading partner to the U.S., far more important to the U.S. than Britain. So they do have some leverage, but it really, in this case, just sadly, for them, comes down to personalities, and they're on the wrong side of that.
Paul Waldie, Europe correspondent at the Globe and Mail, and Natasha Lindstedt, Professor of Government at the University of Essex. Thank you both for joining me on the line. You're listening to The Globalist. Just gone 9:12 a.m. in Jerusalem, 7:12 a.m. here in London. Well, the Israeli authorities are hardening their stance against tens of thousands of ultra-orthodox Jews who until now have been exempt from military service. The Israeli Defense Force is issuing draft notices to all 54,000 members of the ultra-orthodox community whom it believes are eligible. Until recently, an arrangement had been in place that meant they didn't need to serve and, by extension, join in with the war in Gaza. Well, I'm joined now from Jerusalem by Rabbi Dov Lipman, who's former member of the Knesset for the centrist Yesh Atid party. A very good morning to you, Dov.
Good morning, Emma. Thanks for having me on.
A little background here, please. What is it that has exempt ultra-Orthodox Jews from service?
I'm so happy that you asked the question that way, because the background is critical here. When the State of Israel was first founded 77 years ago, there was a fear from the religious side that the country was largely secular in nature, and that for religious young men to go to the army, that would essentially mean the end of their religious observance, because that was just the culture at the time. And therefore, an agreement was reached very early on for an exemption for it was just a few hundred religious scholars who were going to spend their time studying the holy texts instead of going to the army. And the country was okay with that because it was just a few hundred. Over the last 7 decades, that few hundred has become tens of thousands who are claiming to be in the rabbinic seminaries and studying. And in a country where two things have happened. One is there's a need for manpower in the army, given the scope of the issues that we're facing, but also the country has become more religious, and there are opportunities to serve in the military and remain religious. So now this has created a clash where the broader country no longer wants these exemptions to be given anymore, while the hardliners are still saying we want to maintain these exemptions in place.
It's an existential problem then for Israel, isn't it? Because it delves deeply into the Israeli and Jewish identity and how they interact.
It does, and that's why it's important for those who are watching from abroad to recognize that this is really what it's about. It's not some very simplistic surface level kind of issue, but I think what has changed is the fact that the army and the country as a whole has really made moves to come closer to the religious community. You have a brigade that's completely dedicated to the ultra-Orthodox community, which meets all their religious needs because there are sensitivities that are involved. So they have prayer services every day. They have religious study every single day. There are certain issues that the religious community has with interaction between the soldiers and females on the bases or in the command structure. So they're really going out of their way to make those accommodations. And that is why there's a lot more movement from broader Israel and from almost every single party in the political apparatus to change what they've called the status quo. And we'll have to see how that plays out over the next few weeks, because there is a demand from the Supreme Court that legislation be passed that creates what they call equality in national service.
And that equality basically means that 54,000 members of the ultra-Orthodox community now have to step up. What's been the reaction?
So there's definitely a more extreme element, and it's a really small group, but it plays very well for the cameras, where there have been demonstrations and blocking roads and things along those lines. There definitely is a recognition amongst the rabbinic structure that something has to change, and they want to try to find some kind of a compromise. And the bottom line is that out of those tens of thousands that we're talking about, what percentage are really, truly studying the religious texts morning, afternoon, and night? Even secular leaders in Israel would say that's a service for the Jewish state to have people focused on that spirituality, but it's not in the numbers that are getting the exemptions. So there's definitely an overwhelming majority in Israel, even amongst the religious community, that want to see change and want to see legislation. And now it's in the hands of the Knesset's Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee and its chairman, Yuli Edelstein, to try to broker some kind of a deal and a compromise to keep the ultra-Orthodox in the government. But to answer your question, if a compromise is not found that the ultra-Orthodox are satisfied with, they are saying that they will not continue in the government, which could bring down the current government.
How much has this decision been, I think you sort of half answered this question, but let's place this in the context of the conflict in Gaza. How much is this a decision based on the fact that the IDF has a much more increased operational need because it is fighting a war?
It's related to the Gaza conflict, both because of what you mentioned, Emma, and also because of the fact that the Gaza conflict is because we, as an entire country, were attacked by Hamas on October 7th, and the recognition that we need a army filled with all of its manpower in place to fight off this enemy is necessary. But I'll tell you that as a father of a son who's 28 years old and married with 2 children who has done 5 rounds of reserve duty, I want my son to be able to be home with his wife and his children, my grandchildren, and young 18, 19-year-olds, they can be doing their role to fight in the army to alleviate the need for all of these older soldiers to join into the reserves. And that's a big part of the country coming together and saying we have to make a change. And it's also making it much more difficult for the ultra-Orthodox side to avoid that and to run away from that. I'll just mention, we just had the other day 4 soldiers in an ultra-Orthodox unit were killed in Gaza. And that certainly was very startling and jolting for the ultra-Orthodox community, but also a recognition that we have to be we are part of this, and we can be part of this, and we should be part of this as a value in terms of who we are, both as Jews, as religious Jews, and as part of the people of Israel.
There are some critics, however, who say that this is another step by Benjamin Netanyahu to secure power, to effectively safeguard his political future. How correct an assumption is that?
I don't think that this plays into that, and I'm not a member of his party, and I'm not here to either defend or attack the prime minister. I feel that he definitely wants to keep the government together at this particular time because of the war, because we do still face a threat from Hamas. The very fact that these soldiers that were killed the other day, it was from extensive explosives that were placed 1 kilometer from the Gaza border, 3 kilometers from the city of Sderot. That means that even though we've done a lot of damage to Hamas, they're still there as a threat. Many people see this war as, they talk about proportional response. From our perspective, it's not proportional. It's just we have to know that we don't have this threat in place any longer. So I think he does want to keep the government together, but he wants to do so because we're still in the middle of this fight against Hamas, and we really do not want to go to an election until that battle is over.
Rabbi Dov Lippman, thank you so much for joining us on the line from Jerusalem. Still to come on today's programme.
I know it's an old chestnut, but it's still true. Compared with a lot of big European countries, France, for now, still has a kind of demographic fatality that you would not find elsewhere.
That's Gilles Moek. He's a chief economist at AXA, and he'll be telling us about the state of brown France a little later on today's programme. Stay with us.
Each of us has a craft, a calling that inspires us. Whether it's how a coffee is brewed, a chair is built, or how money is looked after. There's a love for the work, a care that compels you forward. For us at UBS, it's about designing a unique outcome for you. Because whatever your craft may be, ours is built around helping you succeed. UBS. Banking is our craft.
Let's continue now with today's newspapers. Joining me in the studio is Jack Dickens, journalist, historian who writes about Europe, America and the Middle East. He's also commissioning editor at Engelsberg Ideas, and he's a new voice. Good morning, Jack.
Good morning.
How are you? Welcome to Monocle Radio.
I'm well. Thank you very much for having me on the show today.
It's lovely. Just to let everybody know that Jack's brought in paper, which is obviously a lovely thing, but he's put it in a plastic folder, the likes of which I haven't seen since I did my A-levels. So I love this, the idea that we are still filing in plastic folders, in paper, in 2025.
Well, sometimes the traditional ways are the best, and we are quite countercultural at Engelsberg Ideas.
What do you do at them? Tell us about your organisation.
So Engelsberg Ideas is a Swedish-backed publication. We're published in London, in English. We publish online every day. We like to think of ourselves as going against the digital storm, so providing readers with longer, more analytical reads to help them go beyond the daily news cycle and understand geopolitics, culture and history.
There you go. You've had your advert. Thank you. Right, tell us what you found in other people's papers today. You wanted to start off with something in the Times here in London.
So, first of all, I wanted to pick up on what I thought was an excellent piece of analysis by Mark Urban in the Times. He is talking about how Trump's Gaza ceasefire plans will depend on some form of cooperation with Hamas. And I think that this really draws out the difficult political trade-offs that exist for all sides in this conflict, but particularly for the US and Israel if they are to bring about a post-war peace settlement.
Indeed, because we've just had a rabbi out in Jerusalem saying that there is an existential threat to Israel, and it is constant and it is present, and so it seems from the people who are out in Israel, this is not something that could be entertained, and certainly not entertained by Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister.
What was that?
The idea that there has to be some sort of compromise.
Oh, exactly.
Some sort of cooperation from Hamas.
I think you're right. I think it's gone to the point now in the conflict where it is extremely difficult for Benjamin Netanyahu to climb down from his maximalist aims, which are the destruction of Hamas and the release of all Israeli hostages. But I think there's an increasing realization, or has been for a while now, that those two war aims sometimes work at cross purposes. And behind the scenes, Trump administration officials such as Steve Witkoff, the president's negotiations guru, are very clear that actually in order to get the remaining 24 or so hostages out of the Gaza Strip, there will have to be some kind of political arrangement with Hamas.
The involvement of the United States is something that's actually key to Mark Urban's piece, isn't it? It talks about the fact that President Trump, always quick with an upbeat take on international negotiations, says that there could be a Gaza deal next week. We had a 90-minute meeting in the White House a little bit earlier today between Netanyahu and Trump. We're not entirely sure what was produced from that meeting, but the fact remains is that the United States is still very much involved in this.
Absolutely. But what I would say is that it's extraordinary for the extent of involvement on behalf of the United States, that there seems to be a real lack of vision. There's an idea to get a ceasefire over the line, yes, and Steve Witkoff says that the administration is very close to getting there, but there doesn't seem to be a vision for what comes next. How do you build a durable political settlement? And I thought one of the most extraordinary things that came out of that Trump-Netanyahu meeting was that when Trump was asked whether he thinks that a two-state solution for Israel and Palestine is still possible, he said that he doesn't know. And I think that's an extraordinary departure from the stated policy of American presidents going all the way back to 1948.
Let's move on to an article in Bloomberg about the Dalai Lama. Tell us about that.
Well, this is quite an extraordinary story. Obviously, we know about the Dalai Lama in the West, mostly because he's a very mysterious Tibetan spiritual leader. The process of selection for every Dalai Lama is also equally shrouded in mystery. So it is all quite romantic and quite interesting. But now this seems to be causing some controversy between China and India. The Dalai Lama has just celebrated his 90th birthday. The succession to the Dalai Lama and the next Dalai Lama will be chosen very soon, presumably. And the Chinese government wants to be involved with the selection process for his successor. India is officially neutral on the question, but when Prime Minister Narendra Modi of India posted a tweet on X the other day wishing the Dalai Lama happy birthday, it caused quite a stir in the Chinese ranks.
It's an astonishing thing. I think we've mentioned this before on Monocle Radio, that the Chinese are trying to say that reincarnation and succession can only actually happen on Chinese territory.
Yes, which is, seems quite extraordinary, doesn't it?
Quite bold.
Yes, it does seem like quite a bold claim, particularly when you consider this is a sort of centuries-old spiritual tradition. It does seem to be new territory for Beijing to be claiming to be able to intervene in the process of reincarnation.
Let's talk about another centuries-old tradition, which is the entente cordiale, or absence thereof, between France and the United Kingdom. Yesterday, we saw a joyous moment when it looked like everybody got on. And this was arguably down to the king.
I know, it was remarkable, wasn't it? It was very refreshing.
Yeah.
I think it's been noted before by commentators that the King and President Emmanuel Macron of France have a particular bond, a political bromance, if you will. And I think it's, like all good sort of Anglo-French bromances, sort of facilitated by wine, champagne and cheese.
And good, and some excellent outfits. Brigitte Macron looked like as if she was going to take off last night in her amazing dress. The wine and the cheese is one thing and is understood. Yet we had some really strong messages from Emmanuel Macron in the British Parliament yesterday, and we have this feeling that that Macron used the opportunity to deliver some very strong political messages.
I think absolutely. I think it would be difficult to exaggerate how powerful some of those messages were, not just when he's talking about building a new special relationship between Britain and France, but also when he drew a very clear equivalence between the threats posed by the United States and China, and particularly excessive dependence on the United States and China.
And one of the things that we also saw yesterday was the role of the monarchy. Now, as a historian and writer, it's quite interesting now, I would imagine, to see how when you need a very big diplomatic statement to be made and that you need your soft power to be at its softest, that you often put in the royal family. You add a non-governmental figurehead just to make sure that the paths are eased.
I think you're right, and I think this just goes to show again the very important role that the British monarchy does play in British diplomacy. I think it was very telling when the late Queen died a few years ago, and President Macron said that to you she was our Queen, but to us in France she was the Queen. And I think that goes to show that there's such respect surrounding this very old British institution that it can be used to the advantage of Britain when it comes to foreign policy.
Finally, you wanted to draw our attention to a piece of very, very welcome soft power exchanges, which is the Bayeux Tapestry, obviously depicting the successful invasion of Britain in 1066. So the story it tells, probably not so great for the British, but actually it's such a glorious piece of history and art and culture and storytelling. It is leaving Bayeux and it's coming to London.
And that's extraordinary. And it's going to be in the British Museum, where it will enrich the extraordinary collections that the museum has. And it'll be fantastic to be able to go there and see this 70-metre long tapestry, which, as you say, is all about the defeat and utter subjugation of the English. So what's not to like from a French perspective?
Journalist and historian Jack Dickens, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. You're listening to The Globalist. Now here's a quick look at what else we're keeping an eye on today. President Trump has sharply criticised Vladimir Putin, accusing the Russian president of duplicity over the war in Ukraine. Mr. Trump swore as he spoke to reporters at the White House, saying we get a lot of bullshit thrown at us by Putin. He said he'd be imposing further sanctions on Russia. President Trump and the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu have met again to discuss a possible ceasefire in Gaza. The talks came a day after the two leaders had dinner at the White House. Earlier, President Trump's special envoy, Steve Witkoff, suggested an agreement between Israel and Hamas was close. And 3 crew on board a Greek cargo ship have been killed in an attack off the coast of Yemen. The vessel was surrounded by speedboats and hit with drones and rockets on Monday. The US Embassy in Yemen has blamed Houthi fighters. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. $14.30 in Kuala Lumpur, which is where we head now, because it's perhaps helpful that Donald Trump sent his letters laying out the individual tariffs 14 countries would be subject to at the start of this week, because many of those nations' foreign ministers are meeting this week at the ASEAN Foreign Ministers Gathering in Kuala Lumpur. And following it from the ground is Hadi and Azmi, who's a Kuala Lumpur-based journalist. A very good afternoon to you, Hadi.
Hi, good afternoon. Happy to hear you, to speak to you.
Good to have you with us. Thank you so much. So just tell us what the atmosphere is like, given the fact that some countries like Myanmar and Vietnam are going in absolutely hammered by huge tariffs from the United States.
Yeah, the whole conference has been very much overshadowed by the new tariffs. The Trump issued all those letters the morning of where all the delegates are coming here to meet. So that has been the main topic of discussion, I was told, from all the meetings. Malaysia itself, as a host, has been impacted. We were negotiating to reduce the tariff, but instead we got our tariffs increased by 1%, which is still significant for a trading country like Malaysia.
So what are people actually talking about? Are people still in shock, or are people trying to work out how to pivot their way out of this thing?
Yeah, ASEAN basically has been trying to negotiate their way out of these trade issues. ASEAN still believes in negotiating as the way forward, but aside from that, ASEAN is pragmatic enough to know that we need to find other ways of other trading partners to offset the eventual reduction in trade with the US. So, in May, ASEAN actually engaged with the GCC in the Gulf States cooperation to explore any new trade possibility with that area. So, yeah, on both ends, negotiating as well as looking for new opportunities.
So there is a sense that they are happy to go elsewhere and that the Middle East could be on the cards?
Yeah, definitely. I think there is a need to explore all options at this point.
Tell us a little bit more about what else is on the agenda, because obviously Donald Trump steamrolled everything with his letters on Monday, but they will have pulled together an agenda before all that happened. What else are they trying to talk about?
Aside from trade, of course, high on the list is about Myanmar, because ASEAN has been trying to end the civil war and the coup that is happening in Myanmar. So far, 4 years on, it's still a stalemate. Not much has been going on there. What ASEAN is trying to do is trying to find a a permanent envoy to look after the situation over there. Because right now the envoy is attached to the chairman states, which only operates on a yearly basis. So the permanent envoy would have more time to actually sit down with the military junta in Myanmar to
Myanmar is a persistent headache for ASEAN, isn't it? Because it doesn't know how to effectively how far to intervene. And we've had the foreign minister, the Malaysian foreign minister, trying to tell Myanmar to create an atmosphere, to create a situation which is conducive to a free and fair election. And the fact is that the last thing that ASEAN wants is to have Myanmar to be this perpetual thorn in its side.
Yeah, and the concept of ASEAN itself, ASEAN tries to stay away from internal issues with its member states, but with Myanmar, even though it's an internal issue, it has become a thorn on the side of ASEAN. So whether ASEAN likes it or not, they need to play a more important role in trying to solve it.
Hadi Azmi, journalist based in Kuala Lumpur, thank you so much for joining us on the line. You're listening to Monocle Radio. This is The Globalist. From the balmy temperatures of Kuala Lumpur now we go to somewhere altogether colder. Canada, the UK and the US have all expressed an interest in buying icebreakers. Those are the giant vessels built to crush through Arctic ice that's several metres thick. Well, the US, it is said, wants 40 of them. After all, Donald Trump is going to need them if he's going to have Greenland. But they are expensive, they're tricky to build and they're slow to build. So why all the rush? Well, let's hear more from Victoria Mitchell, an analyst at Control Risks Maritime Security Team and an expert on the law of the sea. A very good morning to you, Victoria. Welcome to Monocle Radio.
Good morning, Amber. It's nice to be with you.
So why do so many countries want icebreakers?
So icebreakers, the thing to think about them is that they're about access. Now, the Arctic has been a space of cooperation, it's a space of regulation for a long time. And these countries, including the ones you've mentioned, have also wanted icebreakers for a long time. What's changing is the increased access by vessels for an increased period of the year. And that's something that these Arctic states, both the ones you've mentioned and the other Arctic states, all want to secure and to ensure the safety of for the increased periods of the year when they would like vessels to be able to access both increased trade routes and the ports that they control.
So this is all about effectively access to whatever the Arctic can give, either whatever it holds, but also whatever it can allow passage to and from. The Chinese and the Russians are already very good at this kind of thing, and they already seem to have quite a few icebreakers up in the Arctic and are making them as well. So if you can place this in a bit of context, how far ahead are they in the race for the Arctic and its resources compared with the likes of Canada, the UK and the US?
So the Arctic is already delimited. It's a space where we've already had an extended period of cooperation. The Russians have over 53% of the Arctic coastline, and that's a key point for why they have a significant number of icebreakers. China, as what we can call a near Arctic state, has an interest in making sure that their vessels can access the routes for as long in the year as possible, because it will enable a shortened time frame between Asia and Europe through that northern Arctic route. And that's the reason why they have had a long-held interest in having icebreakers. The US and Canada have also had a long-held interest in having icebreakers because of the northwesterly route. But they have just not had the domestic building capacity for a long time. And that's why they're now looking, for example, to Finland to produce icebreakers, because Finland has a significant icebreaker building capacity that now these states have decided they would like to access.
Victoria, I am delighted that you mentioned Finland because our Helsinki correspondent Petri Bertsov has filed us a little explainer, dare I should say, about why the Finns are really so good at doing icebreakers.
Finland is the leading manufacturer of icebreakers. Of the current fleet of icebreakers in the world, Finland has manufactured about 60% of them and has actually designed over 80% of them. So Finland is the leading nation in the world for the construction and the design of icebreakers. But having said that, the current capacity in Finland, it takes from the planning board to delivery, it takes about 2 years minimum to build one icebreaker. Obviously, if you order many similar icebreakers, you can cut down on the time. But still, we're talking, at least a year just for one icebreaker. That's Finland's capacity. There's actually now talk that the US would actually acquiring parts of Finland's existing fleet because, they cannot wait for decades because the race in Arctic waters is happening now. So there's talk of he says he's already made an offer for Finland's latest state-of-the-art icebreaker, but Finland then has countered that offer by saying, well, we won't give you our latest and greatest, we'll give you our second latest and greatest. And there's this art of the deal making going on in Finland at the moment. There's a lot of expectations built into this recent deal that Finland made with Canada. That was for the delivery of one icebreaker. That was worth more than €1 billion, that one deal. So, if we're talking about dozens of icebreakers, this will be probably the biggest order in Finland's industrial history, meaning, thousands and thousands of new jobs. And let's not forget that it's not only the people who construct these vessels, it's actually the whole marine ecosystem around the construction. We're talking tens of thousands of people that are involved in a building and a design and delivery of just one icebreaker. So this is massive news. And of course, these are an immense source of national pride for Finns, and myself included.
That was Petri Bertsov, our Helsinki correspondent, singing the praises of the Finnish ability to construct icebreakers. Victoria Mitchell from Control Risks was listening to that. That idea that it takes 2 years to build, one gets a sense at the moment that geopolitics moves too fast for that.
Yeah, absolutely. The geopolitical headwinds have changed how different states think about the Arctic. But what the challenge is really going back to the question of trade and economic concern and presence in the Arctic. And that is something which has a longer time frame. The ability to access the Arctic isn't going to change. It's going to become more available. Offshore operations are going to become more available. And that's why we need icebreakers, because we're looking at longer timeframes and a variety of reasons to be in the Arctic. Geopolitics is certainly a factor, but economic factors, sovereignty and presence in the Arctic are all factors as well, and those play into a longer time frame, and they will be there over that longer time frame as well.
But if you suddenly find yourself with the Arctic being full of icebreakers, which is arguably what everybody wants to happen who has a vested interest in this, and you're an expert in maritime security, what are the risks there?
Of having an increased number of vessels there?
Yeah, of everybody piling in to the same place at the same time.
So it's a big space, firstly, and the icebreakers will be primarily used within the waters under the control of the states themselves. So if we have a significant number of Russian Arctic vessels, for example, they will be supporting Russian offshore operations, enabling access to trade routes through Russian waters. So it's not that all these icebreakers will suddenly be all converging on point A in the Arctic. They will be spread out, they'll be dispersed, and they will be supporting the different national interests in the Arctic. Certainly some of them will be available for force projection, demonstration of presence, but that will be a small subset of these vessels.
And how much are we seeing now in a more general situation, the situation when it comes to who controls the Arctic? When you mentioned the fact that everybody stays quite literally in their lane in the Arctic at the moment, we have seen, obviously, with the likes of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine and even Donald Trump saying that he quite fancies having Greenland, this idea that the Arctic might not or could not become, or could become rather, a place of volatility. From your point of view, from maritime security, how much are you seeing people talk? How much are people talking about this?
It's an increased discussion point. It's certainly an increased focus for different militaries. We're seeing an increase in drills. We're seeing an effort to be present in northern areas significantly more during the year. So, for instance, with Canada, we've seen a discussion about increasing the troop presence in northern areas throughout the year. Icebreakers and maritime capacity to support that is one element of it, but it's just one part of the toolbox. And in the years to come, certainly in the coming few years, what we're going to likely see is just an increase in efforts to secure a presence there for significant periods of the year through drills, exercises, and cooperative efforts that have been going on in the past, but will be occurring more and more often as we go forward.
Victoria Mitchell from Control Risks, thank you so much for joining us on The Globalist. You're listening to Monocle Radio.
IQ, EQ, and AI. 3 components key to the craft of innovation at UBS. Because to stay ahead in a rapidly evolving age, you need a partner with decades of experience, endless passion for the work, and a finger on the pulse of leading technologies, bridging human expertise with artificial intelligence, all to elevate you. UBS. Banking is our craft.
We turn our focus back to the French economy. We've been talking about the state visit of President Emmanuel Macron and his wife to the United Kingdom. But we want to talk a little bit about soft power and economy, because we have global trade wars, we have endless political problems. So how is the French economy holding up more generally in this? Well, Monocle's Paris bureau chief Simon Bouvier sat down with the French insurance giant AXA's chief economist Gilles Moec to find out how he thinks France will fare in these very complicated times.
Well, I'm going to start with the positives, because there are some positives. I tend to forget that if you spend too long in Paris. But first of all, the demographic situation. I know it's an old chestnut, but it's still true. Compared with a lot of big European countries, France, for now, still has a kind of demographic fatality that you would not find elsewhere. That is definitely going to help. Second, I think a lot of people in the world can name in 30 seconds a fairly long list of French companies and French brands. We tend to forget that, but France produces a disproportionate amount, if you want, of global brands, of global companies, which everyone knows in the world.
And also top executives at global companies.
So, and you have lots of European countries where, honestly, you would not find this sort of ecosystem. Their economies are strong and diversified, but they don't have this sort of presence in the sort of general public opinion. So these are assets. Then where we need to work, say at least 2 key points. One, education. It used to be, honestly, one of our key assets. I despair every time I see another publication of the PISA scores, this deterioration of the French system.
This is the OECD's measurement of how a national school system performs.
Yeah, there's definitely something there that needs to be addressed, because it's our long-term growth. The second is probably about how we deal with the demographic transition, because even if we are in a better position than a lot of other European countries, we also have a fairly generous welfare system, which doesn't cope well with aging. So we need to find a solution to this, and a solution which probably needs to be consistent with French tradition. I've never believed in a sort of big wave of change on these issues. Social inclusion will always remain probably a major goal in France, but we need to change the system enough to make it workable. And if you take the two together, if you need to spend more on education, and if at the same time you're not going to be able to completely change how you deal with aging, the fiscal challenges are going to be very significant, and we need to deal with them. But I would still want to finish with one positive: energy. France is one of the very few countries where energy sovereignty is very, very close to be achieved. And that's thanks to decisions that were made 40, 50, 60 years ago. We've got a pretty good mix, and some mistakes were made, obviously, but we can offer companies operating in France price level for energy that you would not find in a number of other countries. We need also to make the point time and time again that those choices, again from decades ago, are still there. So is the level of infrastructure. So I know it's often difficult, especially in a Parisian context, to be positive, but there are strengths on which we can count.
We can't have a conversation about the global economy and its future without talking about AI. Between the startup culture that we have here in France, the relatively affordable energy costs, do you see that these two things being very significant assets for France to emerge as a player in this field?
I think France is a fairly good position already, in the sense that, as you say, there's a startup culture, and we already have AI producer operating in France. It doesn't happen everywhere. So I'm not going to say that we are on par with what you would find in the US or in China. At least there's some production there. That train was not completely missed. Now, for me, what is key is not just the production of AI, having companies that produce AI solutions. It's also adoption. On this, we've got experience. France was late, for instance, to internet, because we had our own, little system, the Mitel, in the 1980s, which kind of slowed down adoption. But once there was this clear evidence that internet was the solution, actually adoption in France was very quicker than in Germany, for instance. And digitalization in general went faster in France than in Germany. So I'm still hopeful that even if we are not among the top producers, innovators in the technique itself, at least we can adopt it in the way we work in all our companies fairly quickly, because what is great with AI, and that's a difference with some of the IT innovations we've had over the last 20, 30 years, it's a sort of universal technology. You can apply it to a number of use cases. So for me, the productivity gains we will get from AI mostly come from adoption, mostly come from the fact that it's something which, like, electricity 100 years ago, completely revolutionized the way you operate in almost any sector of the economy. And the way to seize it, you need to be nimble. And this is maybe where France is going to have to take a hard look at itself. Adoption of this kind of techniques, we did it fairly well when it came to internet. But you need to be nimble. You need to have a high level of trust in companies. I think we have that, but you also need to have a government that allow exploration before regulating. And very often in Europe, it's not only a French case, but we have this reflex of trying to regulate even before we've seen the use cases being implemented. And this is where I think we need to take a hard look at ourselves.
And that was Gilles Moët, who's the chief economist at AXA, in conversation with Monocle's Paris bureau chief, Simon Bouvier. You're listening to The Globalist on Monocle Radio.
Join Monocle every weekday and let the briefing guide and inspire you through uncertain times, always keeping you ahead of the curve.
It's devolving to a point where we're at odds with each other instead of letting our political leaders do the dirty work, so to speak.
Heavyweight coverage, no white noise, and always delivered with a smile.
The grey areas lead to a lot of sort of awkward conversations, and there's nothing the English dislike more than awkward conversations.
Keep your appointment with the briefing every weekday at 1300 CET, noon in London, here on Monocle Radio.
Finally, we stay in France today for a look at some of the cultural stories making the news. Claudia Jacob is Monocle's writer and keen France observer. She joins me in the studio. Good morning, Claudia. How are you?
Morning, I'm good. How are you?
Good to see you. Let's talk about some of the stories that you've picked up for us. One of them is the radio station France Inter. It's doing rather well. And who here is not going to celebrate a radio station doing well? Just tell us, for those of us who don't listen to France Inter all day, every day, sort of tell us what it is and what it does and what role it plays in France, but also why is it doing well?
So it's part of Radio France, so it's part of France's national public broadcaster, and it's now the most popular radio station in France. And I think the reason why it's so popular is because it has sort of quite a strong generalist perspective. You know, it's well-rounded, it's engaging, it has a strong cultural...
It's a speech radio station.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And it has a strong arts and literature section, and also a 24-hour round-the-clock news. And I think it's managed to maintain sort of a sense of independence. It's almost entirely funded by the television license in France. And it's got over 7 million daily listeners now, which shows that the power of radio still holds.
Which is great. Has this surprised people, given the fact that obviously the world of podcasting is huge, but also the attention span of the average human has shortened enormously, given the fact that we get our stuff online, we get it on demand, and that fundamentally comforting and reassuring presence of the chatter in the corner from a radio is something that cannot be underestimated.
That's right, yeah. And I think the on-demand streaming platforms like Spotify have affected some of France's radio stations. I mean, I think France Inter has remained popular because it's so useful for the commute. But other radio stations like Ici, which was formerly known as France Bleu, has actually had a reduction in its listeners. I think it's a regional network of radio stations, 44 local and regional stations in France, and they're struggling to attract younger listeners because they prefer a network that covers the whole country, that's national, and so it's struggling with listenership numbers. Although it does have a high loyalty rate, people who tend to listen to regional stations apparently tend to stick with them. But yes, they are struggling with the rise of on-demand platforms.
And indeed, this is reflected in an article in Le Monde that basically said radio is in pretty terrible shape in France. It says that radio has lost... Well, 500,000 people have abandoned radio in France over not a very, very long time. It's suggesting that within a year, 500,000 people have decided that they don't want to listen to the radio anymore, which is pretty mean.
Yeah, I think it shows that France Inter must have sort of that edge that's managing to keep people engaged with it. But it does show that radio stations are going to have to keep evolving to stay relevant, because there is just so much choice and so little time and so little of our attention span to grab.
Let's move on to Galerie Lafayette. Huge, beautiful, symbolic shop. Well, just the brand is enormous. Huge in Paris, pretty big in other parts of the hexagon as well. There is a transfer of power, and it is within the family who own it again.
That's right. It's very impressive that a 130-year-old store has managed to stay in the family. This is the 6th generation within the family business model. Arthur Lemoine has become the CEO. He's taken over from his cousin. And, this is, a group that's evolved from a tiny Alsatian haberdashery shop, which started off, in Paris, and now they've grown all over France. They're in Nice, in Strasbourg, and Lyon, but also internationally, which I think is quite remarkable that a French department store has become such a sort of benchmark of sartorial excellence. They're in China, Jakarta, Dubai, Doha, and it's just amazing to see that identity really holds.
I mean, if you go to the Galerie Lafayette in Paris, you know that it is not just for French people. It is a hugely important tourist destination, and I think it's that it's topped €2 billion in revenue in the last year. I mean, how much are we looking at Galerie Lafayette as an international brand? I mean, you mentioned its presence over across the world, but the fact that it is still. Is it still a destination that the international visitors want to come to?
Absolutely, and you're right. The Paris branch is amazing. You should, if anyone's ever there, you need to go to the rooftop. It's like one of those hidden gems where you can see sort of miles and miles around Paris, and it's really amazing. But I think it carries over 3,500 brands, and that's in sort of fashion and luxury and accessories. So that variation has really managed to keep the attention span of shoppers, and they're planning to open in New Delhi and Mumbai this year. And I think it just shows as well how other countries are interested in how France is expanding its retail offering and how they want to sort of buy into that.
And what's quite nice about it is it's not an entirely homogenised space. You do not feel as if you are in a in any luxury department store. There is a real sense of place and Frenchness in Galeries Lafayette.
Absolutely. It's a destination in and of itself, and it really encapsulates everything that is so desired about the French art de vivre, and that's why people want to export it ultimately.
We have 30 questions to talk about kettles and toasters. Go.
Tafel, it's a French brand, and La Poste, it's the France's national postal service. They've joined forces to create what they're calling the aluminium loop, and they're basically using La Poste's 945 sites all over France to form these collection points, so people can drop off their cookware that they're no longer using, and they can recycle it, make it into new pots and pans, and it's quite a clever way to capitalise on the number of post offices that they have in France.
Indeed, it makes you buy more pans and it makes you go to the post office. Monocle's Claudia Jacob, thank you so much for joining me in the studio. And that's all the time we have for today's programme. The warmest of thanks to all my guests, and thanks too to the producers Monica Lillis, Tom Webb, Carlotta Rebello and Ryuma Takahashi. Our researcher was Henry King and our studio manager was Flynn Simons. After the headlines, there's more music on the way. The Briefing is live at midday here in London. The Globalist is back at the same time tomorrow. But for now, from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thank you very much for listening.